out. It is incredible to have some of the descendants of the 29th here. So, just a little about myself before we get going. My name is John Mills. I was born in San Diego, California. And I moved to Connecticut in 1998. I was born to parents that were heavy. Well, my father was really heavy in the civil rights movement at the time. Right? So he was really adamant about, color of your skin, be proud of that. Your features, be proud of that. Your hair, be proud of that. He was really trying to enforce that in my mind. When I got a little older, I had my daughter, I recognized that there were components of that that just didn't click through. Like I had aspects of unconscious bias against myself. Like I was able to recognize it once I got into the workforce. And I realized, I wanted to know, well, why did that happen? How did we get to this place where I had this man that raised me that was like, everything was about the Panthers and the US organization. How do I come to a place where I'm being reflective and seeing where I'm actually likely part of the problem with my own unconscious bias? And so I started digging into that, and once I came to some conclusions. I don't know if they're right or wrong, but I came to some conclusions around media and what I was seeing. But then I wanted to be able to influence the outside world. Like, how do I get others to come to that same recognition that they may have the same thing? But I didn't know how to do that. And then in the 90s, my sister started doing genealogical research. And I still hadn't tied any way that that would help me in my mission, but it was interesting. And she told me, we have some histories back to the South. I've been doing some digging into our family. On the screen to the lower left is my father, and the lower right is my mother, and their parents are above that. And she starts telling me I'm digging into Papa, which is what we call my father's father. And he was from Texas, and his grandfather was enslaved. And that was news to me. That was news to me. And the yellow, when you see the yellow square, that will be where it was an enslaved person. And she tells me, yeah, his grandfather was Ned Mills. And he was enslaved, and I knew my grandfather. He never talked about this. I didn't even know how he got to California. I didn't know anything about that. And so she starts digging further, next slide, and she shows me a census document in the 1880s where this enslaved man that was my surname sake, named Ned Mills, was on an 1880 census in Texas. And so now I was intrigued, along with my great-grandfather, Robert Mills, at least 7 years old. So now I was intrigued. I wanted to know more about that. Next slide. She reaches out to my grandfather's family in Texas. We did not know. We didn't know why he left Texas. She reaches out to them, and they start sending us these pictures. And these pictures were my grandfather's sisters. We didn't know nothing about that. Like we just didn't talk about it before he passed away at 87. So that was amazing to see for me. Next slide. And then she shows me this death certificate. And it was my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother. Her name was Eliza. And it showed that she had died of the Spanish flu and in 1918. And that was very familiar to me. I was like, oh, this flu pandemic of 1918. She died of that. Wow, that was some great history here, right? And she shows me at the bottom of that document, it says she was buried at Hickory Grove Cemetery, Hickory Grove Cemetery in Texas. So I said, we gotta go there. We gotta go see this, right? Next slide. So we fly to East Texas, and we find Hickory Grove Cemetery. And we walk right out. It's this beautiful cemetery. And we're walking through it, but we don't find Ned Mills in there until we notice this lightly driven path along the side of it that led to the back. Next slide. And that's where we started finding our ancestors, in the woods behind Hickory Grove Cemetery. Hickory Grove Cemetery was a whites-only cemetery. And so they buried, all my family were back here in these woods around down trees and shrubs. And so that hit me pretty hard. It was like, so there was segregation in life and in death. And so that really intrigued my brain about, well, what about the other lines of our family? And my sister continued to do research, next slide, and she starts chasing my father's mother. Her family, same thing. They were also from Texas. And they also had enslaved people. All the yellow again, the rectangles are enslaved people. Her mother's, my grandfather's mother's line, both of them, her grandparents both had lines of enslavement. And upper right is a woman named Marguerite, which was an enslaved woman who was born in Africa. And the product of a rape from her enslaver is how was the descension to my grandmother. And to the left, I learned that I was descended, next slide, of a man by the name of Claiborne Connell, who also had a relationship with his enslaved. He was a senator in Mississippi. And so, which I did some digging into him, and those 5 men on the right were his sons. They fought in the Civil War in the Confederacy. So I'm like, wait a minute, I got lineage into Southern white people that were fighting for enslavement. And so we try to find the enslaved people that we knew we were related to in Kyle, Texas, the town named after this man. And next slide, we get to the Kyle Cemetery in this town, and we go to Claiborne Kyle's gravestone. That's where I'm standing there. I can find my family similar to the other line beyond that tree line. If I walked beyond that tree line, I started finding these enslaved people that I knew I was related to by then. And so it's a similar thing, segregation in life and death. Next slide. So then we shift over, my sister shifts over to my mother's family. And my mother's father, his name was John Walter Smith. I knew him well. He was a heavy and hardcore Navy guy his entire life, all the way to his death. But he knew very little about his family. My sister traces that down and learns that his great-grandfather, next slide, was an individual by the name of William J. Cooper. And William J. Cooper was also in the Navy, something that my grandfather never knew when he was alive. But he was also in the Navy. Not only was he in the Navy, he fought in the Civil War. He enlisted in 1864, and he was on multiple different ships during the Civil War, one of which was a ship that was captured by the Union Navy and then redeployed as a Union ship, and he served on that ship as well. And so we wanted to find where he lived. Next slide. In the town, in Baltimore, there are a couple of national cemeteries that were created during the Civil War, specifically because so many Americans were being killed. They needed to move cemeteries, and so they started creating these national cemeteries. And one of the first to be created was Loudon Park National Cemetery. So we assumed, oh, he must be dead. But he wasn't. We found his death certificate, my sister did, and learned that he was buried at a place called Laurel Cemetery in Baltimore, which was an African-American cemetery. It used to be an enslaved cemetery where white Americans were buried their enslaved, and eventually in the 1800s it just became a cemetery where black people buried their dead. And so we went, okay, we've got to check that out. Next slide. We discovered that it had been paved over in 1957. And there's 30,000 African Americans underneath this shopping center parking lot. And so that's where my third great grandfather is. So again, Civil War vet, but he's under there. We're now trying to work with Loudon Park Cemetery to just place a stone, even though he's not there, just to represent that he fought in the Civil War. And then finally, next slide, we start chasing down my mother's mother. Again, all of these people I knew incredibly well. They just didn't talk a lot about these details. We found a lot of this out after they passed away. But my grandmother, I knew she had an accent. I'm in California, but she was just my grandmother. I didn't know where the accent came from. But my sister shows me her Coco Solo base card. Next slide. My grandfather was in the Navy, and she needed a card to get on the base in in the Panama Canal Zone. And right on it says Jamaica. It might sound silly, but I never do that. All my life, all my life. But, and so we learned how she ended up in Panama and how she migrated there and how my grandfather then met her while he was in the Navy. So next slide. That told me a whole story about my entire lineage. It told me that I had ties to all of the different points of the triangular tree, right? I had this European DNA that originates in, and from a European perspective, they imported goods, right? And they would trade those goods to off the west coast of Africa for enslaved people. And they would take those enslaved people over to the West Indies and to the Americas, and they would then work. And then from the Americas, they would get raw goods that would then be used to send off to Europe, and that whole triangle would just keep going, right? And I had lineage in all 3 points. And once I recognized that, it kind of gave me a sense of pride with regards to like who I was here in America. I felt like if anybody's American, I'm American, because you can find my teammates with everything relative to this picture, right? And so that gave me an idea. I thought, the pride that I was feeling relative to that, my struggle earlier in life about bias and my unconsciousness of bias about myself, maybe if I told stories that aren't commonly told, the ones like my own, and that could get people thinking, maybe would get them to reflect. Maybe would get them to think about their possibilities of having unconscious bias. And so that's what I started doing. I talked about a lot of different people, but I incidentally came upon the 29th. Next slide. I was just happened to be researching an individual in Middletown, Connecticut. This individual was enslaved in Middletown almost all of his life. And when he's like 87 years old, he's convicted for attempting to poison his slaver. And he's sent to prison, and he's stayed in prison all of his life. He dies at 110 years old. And by the time he dies, he's at Wethersfield Prison. And Wethersfield Prison today is the Department of Motor Vehicles in Wethersfield. And right next to it is Cove Park, which is where the prison cemetery is. So at the time, I'm thinking this guy's buried at this prison cemetery, right? And so I'm talking to local historian, and Frank Bernarski is an individual from Wethersfield that I was talking to about this enslaved man I'm researching. And incidentally, I discovered that he wasn't buried there. He had been sent to Yale for dissection. But he tells me, well, John, there was another guy buried here. His name was Nicholas Monroe, and he fought in the Civil War. And I was like, wow, okay, well, I want to learn about this guy. And so, next slide. So I start digging into this guy, and I find his muster roll, right? And at the time, I knew nothing about the 29th. I knew nothing about the 30th. I didn't know about, it becoming a federal regiment, turning the 31st. I didn't know anything about these regiments. And so when I looked at his muster roll document, I just saw he was in the colored troop from Connecticut. And it said he had enlisted in the 30th, and then I saw 31st. I didn't get all that. I just was like, you're right, he fought the Civil War. Let me go research this guy. Next slide. So I'm looking through old newspapers, right? And I find this newspaper from 1880 where he's living in Hartford, and it seemed like he was living around other veterans. And he's trying to make money. And so he's in this prize fight, and it's being advertised. And he has it says this man who has one eye, and he's fighting some other guy who has one leg, trying to make money. And so I still dig into that to figure out if this was a veteran community. I think it may have been, because it seems like everything I find is around these disabled men. But anyways, next slide. He eventually gets sent to prison for theft. And while he's in prison, he gets sick. The warden there was feeding them lots of spoiled food, and lots of people are dying and getting sick. But he gets sick, he dies, and they supposedly bury him in the prison cemetery, which is right next to prison, which is today Cove Park. But then I found this other article, next slide, this other article that said the warden was being investigated, and they're talking to guards, and the guard says, under oath, he says, I had this job, and we had to go dig up Nicholas Monroe to send him to the state institution. So it was back to what I found out about the other slave person that I was researching. He was sent to Yale for dissection too, right? And that kind of upset me. So, you know, is that a coincidence that two people I find out were sent for dissection? And so I'm at the state library talking to Kevin Johnson and at the state library. I'm doing research on this Nicholas Monroe guy. He says, and on the 29th, he said, well, maybe you should go down to Haven and check that monument they have down there. They got names of people on there. Maybe he's on there. Maybe you'll learn more about the units and all that. Oh, okay. Knowing nothing about the monument, I drive down to here to New Haven. Next slide. Did my little Google Maps. Where is it at? And then I learned that it was Criswell Park, and I drove down here and I drive over the Chapel Street Bridge. And I park right there in the grass and walk over there and checked out the monument, but Nicholas wasn't on there. Then I realized there were other people that were on there, so I was trying to figure out, like, well, why aren't they there? Which then drove me into some deeper research. Next slide. Because I could go and find Nicholas on the wall in D.C. and I found him in the African American Memorial D.C. I found him there. But again, I'm still not making a tie. No, it's the 29th and the 30th. Like, I'm still not tying it, right? He's in the 30th. But anyways, it was probably good I didn't, because it kept me kind of digging. Like, well, what is this all about? So I realized at that point I need to learn more about the Civil War at the time. Like, what was that going on then? And is this just another incident that's similar to my people that I had been researching, my own family, and this guy's just kind of lost somewhere, like people don't know about him? Like, what is this? So then I started digging into the Civil War. Next slide. And some things I knew, right? I knew the basics. Like, I knew that the South wanted to broaden slavery into the new territories, and the North didn't want to do that. I had this basic knowledge of that, right? Like, I knew that Lincoln was voted in, and there was not they didn't get particularly any votes from southern states, and he was still voted in. So the South had this perspective that, well, what are we going to do if our vote isn't even enough to kind of get this guy out to be president? I knew that there was a new Republican Party that was about kind of not proliferating slavery. But that was probably the extent of my understanding of it. But what I learned in digging into it is that that prompted the Civil War. But as the Civil War was underway, as it relates to African Americans beginning to fight, what I learned was, with each step Lincoln made, it was initiated by an action or an event. That's what it appeared to me. That was my perception. I learned that in June 25th, 1862, I learned a little bit about the 7 Days Battle in Virginia. I learned about how many people died and the number of casualties in those battles over those 7 days. I learned about the number, 16,000 Union casualties, 20,000 Confederate casualties. And immediately after that battle, I learned that Lincoln signed into law the Confiscation Act of 1862. And that was an interesting document to me when I read it. Because it had, slavery was in that document. It talked about, it appeared to me, the war is not going so well, so let's put some more pressure on the South. Here's the pressure we're going to put on them. if you're a part of the rebels, you're engaged against us, then as far as we're concerned, you're enslaved or free, and if they run from you and get to us, they're free. That element of it was interesting to me, because he wasn't saying, if you're in a southern state and you hold an enslaved person, but you're not a part of the rebellion, your slaves are free. He's just talking about these officers or people that are supporting the rebellion. You're enslaved. And so that was interesting to me reading that. And then I read about the Militia Act of 1862, which was an update to the Militia Act of 1792, which in the 1792 Militia Act was very specific. It was like, to be in the army, in a militia, you had to be white. And so the Militia Act of 1862 changed that. It said, you don't have to be white, you can be of African descent. And that's kind of critical to me. Like, they just had this big war, all these people die, and then Lincoln goes, okay, hold on, by the way, we might start putting black people in our army. Like, it was a tactic, right? Next slide. And so, you see it spoken in, this is just me wording it out, basically, what I just told you about. So I won't redo that, I know we're limited on time. Next slide. The Militia Act, though, is much more interesting to me. And particularly, what they say at the bottom of this document. Persons of African descent who under this law shall be employed shall receive $10 per month and one ration, $3 of which monthly pay may be in clothing. Basically, they're saying, we're going to put African Americans in the U.S. Army, but you can just pay them $7. 10 minus the $3 for the clothing. Like, it's right in the law. Now, I had heard people tell me before, they were paying black people $7. And I thought it was just like some decision, some colonel made or some regiment made. But when I read that, wait a minute, this was law. The law was, you give them black people, you give them $7. Right, so that was interesting to me. Next slide. And then I started digging into, well, what did the white soldiers make? And that's when I learned that this was a paid scale at the time. And so entry, private level, was $13 a month. So it was like half, right? And they weren't taking money out of their monthly for clothing. And so that was interesting to me. Also, I coded the slide with the color coding, with the gray and then the yellow, just because I also have been hearing a lot, people would tell me that, black people were promoting, and they were promoting the officers. And so this gave me a better gauge to what that meant, because everything after private is considered an officer. So those gray rows there are non-commissioned officers. And once you get the yellow, those are commissioned officers, meaning some government or entity appointed. Excuse me. So then I can really kind of gauge it better when I look at these mustard documents. If somebody got promoted to be an officer, meaning they're now a corporal, they were still making the same money. Right? It's a prestigious thing, but it didn't do much for their money. Like, it gave me a better gauge of like what I'm looking at when I'm looking at these mustard documents. So anyway, after the Militia Act of 1862, next slide, you start seeing all these colored regiments pop up, right? Mid-1862, literally immediately after. There's like 3 regiments in Louisiana. One is in South Carolina, another one in Kansas. And I know Louisiana is a southern state, but there were portions of Louisiana that were still controlled by the Union. And those portions, they started raising these regiments. And next slide. The next major incident is that I can see that prompted Lincoln to do something is the Battle of Antietam. And so that still is the deadliest single day of war in U.S. history. 12,000 Union casualties in one day and 10,000 Confederate casualties. And so another reflection point for Lincoln, he's like, this is bad. We got to do something, right? And immediately after that, you have Lincoln issuing his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was essentially a threat, right? It was like, okay, I know we said that these enslaved people of you soldiers, we're going to free them if you guys would stop. But now, if you're not going to stop in 100 days, everybody that's in a southern state, in a Confederate state, if they're enslaved, they're free. Like he just upped the ante, right? Because things were bad. Just went through another bad battle. And so 100 days from September 22nd was January 1st of 1863. And so in the interim, the Confederate president also issued his proclamation. Right? It was like a response to the proclamation. And I'll show you that in a second, where Jefferson Davis basically just says, well, look, you guys are going to start, you're putting all these threats about what these black people are going to do, and they're going to be in these regiments. If we find them, then it's not going to be like this prisoner of war thing. We're just going to turn them over to our southern states, and they're going to deal with it. Right? It's more or less like, if we catch them, they're going to die. Right? He kind of comes back to the Emancipation Proclamation with that. So anyways, the Emancipation Proclamation does not have its desired effect. States didn't stop the secession, they continued. And so, because of that, on March 3rd of 1863, Lincoln signs in the Enrollment Act of 1860. And this is critical because that's a draft. He's saying, okay, I need people from all of these northern states. And Connecticut was one of them. It was like, Connecticut, you guys need to give me people. There was criteria, a certain age, and if you're over a certain age, you didn't have to go. And if you were in a particular age range, you were married, you didn't have to go. So there were all these criteria. But after all of that criteria, there was still a quota from the state of Connecticut. They needed to supply just under 8,000 men. Right? So that's an interesting point to remember. Next slide. And this is out of Jefferson Davis's response to the Emancipation Proclamation and his statements about, we're just going to turn these people over to the states. Right? We catch these black people fighting against them. So that's just a pictorial so you can see. Next slide. And so, if you put this into context, the Militia Act was signed into law in 1862. Regiments started being formed that were African American regiments. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into law, and more African colored regiments. I mean, that's what all these other states are doing, beating their numbers. Why don't we just do that? And that wasn't met all that kindly. Next slide. This individual, William Eaton, he was, at the time, he was a Hartford judge. But he had previously been in the Connecticut House of Representatives. He would go on to be a delegate from Connecticut. He would also become a U.S. Senator representing Connecticut. He would be in the U.S. House of Representatives representing Connecticut long after the Civil War. And he immediately responded back. He's like, raise a colored regiment? What are you, crazy? You're going to give them guns? They're going to turn and start shooting people. They're going to invade homes of their former masters, lust, raping, and murder. Right? He's like, there is no way we should be raising a colored regiment in Connecticut. But Connecticut didn't have a choice. The federal government was saying, you need to give us 5,400 more people. So, next slide. They eventually agreed, and Connecticut proceeded to raise a colored regiment, being given the permission. Benjamin Party now started that process. Next slide. Early into January, now remember they had until January 5th to raise this 5,400 men. I'm not sure how far they got to that, but I know that at least 826 of them by January 7th, they had gained. And they knew that by the 12th, they would have 1,000, which was their goal. They were kind of thinking we might get 1,000 in the African American community if we raised the color regiment. And so they were really excited about we're going to be able to get 1,000 men, and we might be able to get even more. So I'm doing this research, I'm learning all this stuff, right? And so then, and I learned that at that point, that's when they started trying to recruit for the 29th. And that was the first time I had seen the word grapevine plan. Like I had never really, I probably should have, but in retrospect, I think that was right on the Google map that I searched. But they were talking in the newspapers about them being reared at Grapevine Point. So I started looking, where's Grapevine Point? And next slide, I find, this 1852 map. I'm looking through my AP records, right? I'm looking at all these maps, and I find the 1852 map. They're right at the bottom, it says Grapevine Point. I put that star there because that's Chris Paul Park, where the red star is. That's where the memorial is. But that, I pieced that together while looking at the map. I was like, oh, that's where I was standing when I was looking at that memorial at Cristobal Park. I then learned, next slide, I learned that Frederick Douglass had come to talk to those men while they were down there at Cristobal Park and being reared. I learned that he was there on January 29th of 1864. He said, it was reported in a newspaper called the Connecticut War Record, it was a paper here in New Haven, that he was there. I can't find it anywhere else. Like I find in like Hartford Courant at the time, they mentioned it. Yeah, Frederick Douglass went down to New Haven, but they don't really go any further than that. But this paper went into detail, kind of talked about what he said. And some of his words struck me. Like he's talking to the 29th at the time, and he says, you are pioneers of the liberty of your race. He goes on later on in his speech to say, on you depends the destiny of 4 million of the colored race in this country. If you rise and flourish, we shall rise and flourish. Right? It was pressure. Right? When I was listening to it, it was like they had the weight of the world on their shoulders. Like everybody's dependent on how they present in the Civil War. Next slide. I then found other articles in the papers of the day at that time where Connecticut residents started to kind of warm up to the idea. But they were warming up to it because they started thinking, wait a minute, if these African Americans are fighting, then in areas where it's real dangerous, we could send them and our white men won't get killed. Like that was kind of the perspective, right? You could see that written in a lot of locations. But for me, it presented me with a thought that I had prior, which was that slavery to me was precipitated by the idea of bias and racism. That's what made those folks believe that they could enslave a person. And in Connecticut, slavery was gone. But those elements of racism and bias were not. They were deeply entrenched, and you see it everywhere. Especially in the fact that they didn't rear a colored regiment until they were in a corner. Right? That was really clear to me, and then those statements that I was reading. Next slide. So then I started digging into the work, and I learned more about specifically what people were experiencing. See, I'm about people. Like I'm trying to figure out how were people feeling, what were their thoughts, and how were they being treated? What was that all about? And so I found 2 narratives that were written about that time. One by a man named Isaac J. Hill, and another by an individual by the name of Alexander Heritage Newton. And so I started digging into those to see if I could get some context around what did they feel like at the time? What was their perspective? Next slide. And I learned that Isaac J. Newton wasn't really from Connecticut. So before this, I thought everybody that was enlisted in New Haven was like Connecticut was just like rearing people from here to get numbers. But then I started noticing that a lot of people were actually coming here, and then Connecticut was listing them as giving credit to towns here, but they weren't actually from here. And Isaac J. Hill was one of them. He was born in Selling Grove, Pennsylvania. He was bound out to a man in Kentucky because his family was really poor, and he talks about that in his narrative. He talks about how this man took him to Kentucky, and he got to see slavery right up close and personal. But he talks about learning to read and write from young white kids. And then when he got a little older, the locals found out that he could read, and they were like, "Oh, you gotta go." So they sent him back to Pennsylvania because he could read. And he knew about the ensuing contention between the North and the South. He wanted to be instrumental in that. He wanted to have some way of influence in that. So he joins the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry in 1861. Now, back then, black person couldn't really fight against the law. So I don't know what his role was with that cavalry, but he was going out with that cavalry. And next slide, he talks about how he got to the Navy. He says, he's in this 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, and he said, when the rumor reached me that the government was enlisting colored men, I then left the regiment and went home, and in 1864 enlisted in the 29th Connecticut Regiment. So he just was at home in Pennsylvania, and he got word to him that they let black people fight. And he raced down here to New Haven, right? Next slide. So then similar context with the other narrative that I read from Reverend Alex Heritage Newton. His autobiography is much more detailed, more than just about the 29. But the section about his life and the 29, he talks about how he was born in New Orleans, North Carolina. His mother was free, but his father was enslaved. He talked about similar thing to Isaac J. Hill, that he was bound out so that the family could make more money, and that he thought, my mom's free, I'm free, I'm just working for you guys, and if I don't want to do something, I could just decide not to do it. So one day he's asked to carry a bench, and he was like, no. And so because of that, he ended up getting tied up in 39 lashes. So he had all these scars on his back from the 39 lashes. He was out of work for 3 weeks, and from that point forward, he started fighting to free the enslaved. He was a part of like getting people into the Underground Railroad. And he eventually wanted to leave, but even though he wasn't really enslaved, he could just leave the employer. So he describes it as he fled to New York. And he gets to New York, and there his mother had preceded him there, and she was working with other abolitionists. He marries an abolitionist newspaper editor's daughter, and then he joins the 13th New York Regiment in 1861. Similar story to Isaac J. Hill. He's now in some regiment. He can't fight, but he's going out. Next slide. He then tells a story that I found fascinating. He talks about how while he was with the 13th New York Regiment, he was sent down into Brooklyn to fight rioters who were burning down a colored orphanage. So that's kind of a historic moment in time. Basically, in New York, there was a fear, the working class, Irish in the town, there was a fear that if Lincoln frees the enslaved people, they'll all come to New York and take all of their working class jobs. So they were scared of that. And so they were for the war, but just to preserve the Union, not to free the enslaved people. And as soon as he issued that Emancipation Proclamation, these people in New York were upset. Because now they thought they were going to lose jobs when all these black people come to New York, and in their minds, they take all the jobs. And so then 3 months later, after the Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln issues a draft order, and by the way, in the draft, you could pay your way out. You could pay $300, and that would be to the federal government, and then they would find somebody else. And so $300 back then was like $6,000. And so the working class couldn't pay it. So the richer folks were getting out of the war. The working class that were already upset about the possible losing their job, now they were really upset. So they started rioting, and they're just killing black people on sight. Hundreds of black men were killed in the rioting, and at one point they go to this orphanage that was filled with black children, and they start burning it down. And so that's when Alex Newton comes back into play. So he's with the 13th Regiment. He's being sent down there to quell this thing with his regiment, and the rioters turn on him. And so they're like, get that, and he starts running. He ends up running to the docks. He gets on a boat that takes him to New Haven. So now he's here in New Haven. He lives here for 5 months and then realizes that, oh, they're letting black people fight now. And that's when he enlisted in 20. Both of these gentlemen tell stories about the bonuses that were to be received, or that they did receive, when you read their books. And one, their descriptions are a little different. And so I wanted to dig into that. Why did one individual receive all this bonus money and another individual did not? Next slide. And so I found out some information that might tell the story. The state of Connecticut issued, or the Attorney General's office in the state of Connecticut issued General Order number 16 on December 2nd. It basically said that if you were to enlist, the federal government is going to give you $302 as a bonus. This isn't your monthly pay. This is just a bonus. $302 for enlisting. And another $100 if you had fought before. If you were a veteran, you got $402. And the state of Connecticut, because they really needed these people, because they had until January 5th to get 5,400 people, they were chipping in another $300 on top of that if you enlisted before January 5th. Right? And then they were saying, oh, and we'll give you another $30 in $10 installments. So it was like a lot of money here, right? And then the federal government was saying, and whoever goes and procures these people, they're going to get $15 recruitment fee. So you get paid too if you brought them to us. And if they're a veteran, we'll give you $25, and Connecticut will go, yeah, the recruiter will give the recruiter $10. So there was a lot of money at play. But within a week of putting out that general order, Connecticut put out another one. They were cold. They put out General Order number 17. They were like, wait a minute. But if you're black, so now the first general order was really founded for white Americans. So now the second one is now for African. And it says for an African American, you ain't get nothing from the federal government, it's zero. I don't know if that's because the federal government wasn't sending it to Connecticut, or they were just keeping it, or they weren't sending it to them at all. I don't know. But Connecticut was like, you're not going to get anything from the federal government. But Connecticut said, well, we'll give you the $300, because we need you to enlist. If you list by the 5th, we'll give you the $300. And so that was the context from those general orders. Next slide. And it kind of made the narratives make a little more sense to me. Like Isaac J. Hill says, we were to receive a bounty of $310 from the state, $75 from the county, from which you were enlisted, and another $300 from the United States. But all I got was $310. Like he was thinking of the first general order. He didn't know about the second one, I guess. He was thinking they cheated you. Whereas Alexander Newton is like, all I got was $15. I don't even know what y'all talking about. They gave me $15. Right? And so there was a disparity there. I'm like, why? $15? Why didn't they give me $15? I don't know if I found the answer to that question. I'm still digging into that, but I might have found the answer to that. Next slide. Well, at the time, in a lot of the newspapers, there were statements about Colonel Pardee, who was the person who brought this idea of raising black regiments. It was said that when black recruits were coming in, he was like sliding money in his pocket, and he was giving recruiters some extra money too, and he was giving us left. So, and that was a common accusation against him. So, I don't know if that's why Alex only got $15, or maybe he just didn't remember how much he got. I don't know, but it made me wonder if that's why he only got a portion of the next slide. I also learned that these men knew each other. Like when I read both of their narrative, they talk about talking to each other, right? They were both religious men, so they talked, and specifically Alex Newton, like he looked up to Isaac Hill, and you can tell he was like 11 years younger. So That was like a mentor to him. That was interesting to me to read as well. Next slide. The next thing that I found interesting about their stories is something that I've never heard of. Isaac J. Hill says when they were being deployed from the enemy, he says the flag was presented by the Reverend Dr. Mike. On account of the regiment not receiving the $75 which was promised them after enlistment, they made no response to the presentation. So these black men in the 29th were like, you have to pay us. They had the flag. Now, I mean, that was meaningful to me because when I heard about Jesse Owens and him coming back and they invited all the white athletes to the White House, but he wasn't invited, and his statements about that. I've heard about the 68 Olympics and the black men on the podium with the raised fist and their defiance over inequality. I heard about that. I heard about Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf in the early 90s and him and the NBA, just standing because he's kind of protesting racial inequality. I heard about Colin Kaepernick before, but I never heard that the 29th, made a statement about the fact that there was inequality with regards to pay. That was an interesting thing to me that I think we should probably know. That's way before any of those incidents, right? So anyway, next slide. I start mapping what Isaac J. Hill is saying in his narrative. He goes into detail, like, we deployed, and we marched through the primary streets of New Haven, and we ended up at the public square. We were on a major road. I think he probably talked about Grand Avenue to Elm, but I'm assuming he said we ended up at the public square, which is New Haven Green, so I'm assuming that's what he was talking about. And then he says, and we were there for a little while, and then we walked down Chapel Street, and we turned on State Street, and we went to the Long Wharf. Like, so he's so descriptive, you can literally walk exactly where he said they were going with their deployment when you read his narrative. He also talks about how the people of New Haven, there were some people crying and wishing them well, and all these well wishes as they marched. And Alexander Newton says that as well, but he also interjects that, and some people were laughing at us. And so that I caught that as well, like as if everyone didn't see it as these are men of dignity going somewhere. It's like, yeah, that's funny. Next slide. Isaac Hill talks about how he's woken up and he talks about how he's introduced to Colonel William Wooster and he's introduced to William Wooster as the regimental orderly. He's being assigned to William Wooster. And that was the first time he had met him. And that's the first instance where I realized, he's like a servant to the colonel, so he's to stay with the colonel. Which is interesting because you get a lot of detail about what's happening because Isaac Hill is with the colonel at every step, right, as they're being told. Next slide. He talks about how they got on a ship and it took them to Annapolis, Maryland, initially, and how they were given their weapons for the first time in Annapolis. And Maryland was a free, slave state, but it was also a border state. And so none of this Emancipation Proclamation, none of that applied to them because they didn't secede. They remained in the Union. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to these Confederate states. So when they got to Maryland, they're still enslavers and enslaved people. And so in both of these narratives, these people, in both of these individuals talk about how the enslaved people and enslaved there didn't treat them very well. Like they looked at them with disdain, right? Even though it's a Union state, right? They talk about how they're treated. Next slide. Isaac talks about while he's in Annapolis, he's a preacher. So he goes to the local Methodist church and he gives a sermon, and while he's there, he's advising a sermon. And then when I'm reading Alexander Newton's narrative, he talks about going to that sermon and listening to Isaac J. Hill speak, and you kind of get that feeling like this is a mentor of his. By the way, these books are written decades apart. Isaac J. Hill's book was written in 1869. Alexander Newton's book isn't written until 1910. So they're like 40 plus years apart, but you see these overlaps. Next slide. So from there, they get on a ship and they're taken to South Carolina, and then they get off at South Carolina, and then they march over to Beaufort, South Carolina, and then I think that's the common picture you see of the 29th. While they were at Beaufort, South Carolina, sometime during that period that they were there, this picture was taken. They were there from April 13th all the way to August 9th. And there they got for training and the drills, and so that's where that picture I learned came from. Next slide. Also, while they were in South Carolina, that's when they were just for the first time getting their monthly payment. Right? And that was the first time they get this $7. Right? Man, the regiment is like, this is crazy. What are you giving us $7 for? This is demeaning. And it was interesting when I read Isaac Hill because he's like, I refuse to take that $7. That's disrespectful. I'm not taking that $7. But he's also angered at the rest of the 29 because they end up taking it. And so that's what his statement there is. He's like, he said, this has been a failing with the colored race. They are always ready to comply with wrong teachings of strange gods, especially when they come from white men. I would not and did not accept the $7 per month, and I stood entirely alone. And so he mentions that, but then I was able to see further documentation of this similar thing happening everywhere. It wasn't just in the 29th. Next slide. I see in the New York Daily Herald at the time, the Massachusetts 54th and the Massachusetts 55th and colored regiments in Pennsylvania, they were doing the same thing. Like the entire regiment were just saying, we ain't taking the $7. Like, we're not. That's ridiculous. And so, because of that, this is creating an issue that goes against this tactic that we're making putting into place. And so, very quickly, next slide, Congress passes an Equal Pay Act, making it so that, okay, now we're going to be paid equal to white soldiers because of what this caused. And because of Black America just stood up, this regiment folks just stood up for themselves, refused to take the money. And so I don't know show the time, I'll speak a little bit, but they go from South Carolina, they get on a ship, they're taken to Virginia, and now they're in the heat of the battle. They become a part of what today is known as the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, which was a campaign to try to conquer the cities of Richmond and Petersburg. And so it's interesting to me that they were sent there because, this is the soul of the Confederacy, right? Like Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy. And so they're being taken to a place where they're going to be like hard stances protecting these places. Like I would assume this is going to be some dangerous work where they're being sent. So that's where they're sent. Next slide. And I'm just going to take some statements that I saw out of those days and those months that they were there. They were there all the way through April of 1865. This is one statement that I read out of Alexander Newton's book where he talks about how after a particular battle, there were arms and legs piled up like hog's feet in a butcher shop. The dead and the dying were strewn over the battlefield for 5 months. Like he saw a lot of death and destruction. He talks about that. Next slide. Isaac J. Hill's statement during those battles, he says, the complexion and rank of a man has a great bearing. There was a great distinction made among the women. Why he says that is because at some point he talks about how there was an individual he saw that was shot in the head within the 20 minutes. And so he tries to work with him. He plops him up against a tree. The medics are working on other people. And so, but he has to get back to his section. So we prop him up on a tree so that they can see him. You need to get to this guy. He leaves. He comes back hours later. The guy's still in the same exact position. A young soldier in the 29. And so that's the impetus of his statement. He's like they're working on all these white individuals, but this black guy sitting here hurt, and they're kind of ignoring him. He had a perspective of the color of your skin become matter in whether or not you treat it anyway. Next slide. There was another battle where they were they were to charge the rifle trenches of the Confederates, and they were overtaken. And in doing so, they kind of gained some prestige in their bravery. And because of that, another regiment presented them with the American colors, a flag, because of that bravery. And I was at the Connecticut State House, and they have a flag at the State House that the 29th carried. And so, and it makes me wonder if this statement that he's making in his narrative, when they're presented the colors to carry, is the very flag that is displayed at the State House. I think it might be. It might correlate directly with Isaac J. Hill's book. Next slide. But right next to that flag at the Connecticut State House is their actual flag, their 29th flag that they carried in battle. Battered and torn and worn because they carried it. But it was in the basement of the State House from 1865 until 2015 when they brought it out of the basement and they put it up for display. So if you're ever interested in seeing that, that's on permanent display at the State House. Next slide. Over time, so they've been there for months, and now we're into April, and Confederates have now retreated out of Richmond. They walked into Richmond, the 29th, about one of the first regiments to walk into the capital city of the Confederate, it's burning and smoke everywhere, as like a conquest. They're like one of the first regiments to walk in. And in his narrative, Isaac is talking about standing on the banks of the James River and seeing President Lincoln come up in a boat with his son and get off, and he's witnessing African Americans congratulating him, praising him for this victory. He watches him walk through the streets of Richmond, and he talks about the enslaved there, calling him their savior. He also talks about seeing a white woman look at Lincoln with disdain, right? And we're in the middle of the South in the capital city. And so that was interesting. Like, he's witnessing this as a member of the 29th. He witnessed that all happen. Also, we've kind of been talking about the 29th this whole time. But what I found when I was researching is, as the Confederacy retreated out of Richmond and out of Petersburg, they were trying to get to North Carolina, and they were cut off. And they created that uniformity. And as they created them, they started renumbering regiments and giving them a designation of a federal name. And so the 30th is now the 31st United States Troops. But they talk about both of those Connecticut regiments walking through the streets of Hartford. And this particular article I found, it was this individual, whoever this author was of this article, he says 1,400 black soldiers who have gone forth to battle for many white men who have remained at home and abused them in their race. These in line ought to feel proud. Like, they were trying to get Connecticut citizens to come out to this parade to celebrate these black men walking through the streets. So they were kind of guilting them into ensuring that they come out to this parade. And so it ended up being this major event, and both Alex Newton and Isaac Hill talk about it. Next slide. Isaac Hill talks about how the great reception was made for us. We paraded through the principal streets of Hartford. Next slide. Alexander Newton says, some went to their homes after, others remained in Hartford until they had spent all their money and were locked up in the prisons by the police officers. Which brought me right back where I started. I started this journey with Nicholas Monroe, who was in prison. Because that's exactly what happened to him. He wasn't from here, he comes here. And specifically, Nicholas Monroe came here just to fight. He heard the Connecticut was dead, black people fighting. He came here. After the war was over, he just decided they were great here in Hartford. I'll just stay here in Hartford. And eventually, he doesn't have money, and he robs someone, and he goes to prison, and then he's in that field that I thought he was in, and then I find out he's sent to me. So this kind of took me around, full circle when Alexander Newton was talking about men who stayed in Hartford. To give you some context about Connecticut at the time as well, next slide. I was looking at other articles of the time, and I learned that in September of 1865, so this is 2 months before the 29th and the 30th come home, but this is some 6 months after they had walked through Richmond, and the Civil War is essentially over at this point. But Connecticut citizens who was put up for vote for them, they were like, you know what? Maybe we should let black men. What do you Connecticut citizens? Should we let black men vote? And so they put that up for a vote in Connecticut. And the thought of black men voting caused a lot of editorials in the papers at the time. And they would say things like, if we let black people vote, they might feel equal. I mean, you read this right in the paper. He said, they might elect Negroes if we let them vote. They might become friends with white men, and they might intermarry with white women. And because of all these fears and all these editorials, Connecticut votes that down. They're like, no, we're not going to let black men vote. Remember, this is 2 months prior to the 29th and the 30th coming up. What's interesting about that when I read that, just to give you a little more context, is as a requirement to rejoin the Union, Confederate states had to register black men to vote. And so, as we were talking earlier, like my second great grandfather, Ned Mills, he was enslaved in Texas. He was freed on Juneteenth. Next slide. I find him registered to vote. But had he been in Connecticut, that wouldn't have been allowed. But in Texas, my second great grandfather, former enslaved man, was registered. Again, back to the point that I think at the time, I think slavery was legal. But bigotry and racism and bias was seeped in Connecticut. Next slide. I also heard a lot of numbers about the enlistments, and so I wanted to kind of figure that as well. And I found this book online, which I could have just bought down with the PDF, but I bought this book from the bookseller. And it was a book that was requisitioned by a Jew general in Connecticut in 1869. And it was like, we want a list of every person that served in any Connecticut regiment. And so this book was put out to do that. And so I was using that for numbers until Emma showed me a book from 1889, 20 years later. And she gave me a copy of the pages, and I started comparing it with the 1869 book. Wasn't quite right. They left a bunch of people out. They didn't have residences right. The wounded were wrong. The numbers weren't. So I assumed the Jew general didn't requisition another one in 1889. That one appears much more accurate. When I look at those numbers, that's my book I was writing. Those numbers are from the book that Emma has here at the museum. Those numbers show that enlistments in the 29th, commissioned officers, that highest level, there were 48 of those commissioned officers. Non-commissioned, there were 211. Privates, there were 1,035, and there were 12 people that were unassigned because they enlisted. But then before they were assigned to a particular regiment, they were discharged for whatever reason. So that was 1,306 people. And I did the same thing, next slide, for the 30th. And those numbers were what you see on the screen. So all in total, we're just under 1,800 people, which includes the officers, which is a little different than I had thought. That was a lot more than I had thought. Next slide. I also did in case you're interested, I checked those books that they talk about casualties as well, and so I see much more accurate numbers than I had ever heard before with regards to those that were killed in battle or from a wound and then died in battle. That's 48, or just died of disease. 178 people in the 29th, or people that were just wounded, 139 of them. There were 103 people that were discharged. So that would just be you enlisted, but you're not going to get ahead because you got something that's alien that's not going to work. So they discharged those people. And then there was one person accounted for and one person captured. So that's just in case you were interested. I got that from that book. Next slide. So that gets me a whole other perspective of the mind, right? Like, I think it's an incredibly prideful thing that whomever decided to do that did that. But I think the state should be doing something for these people. If I'm speaking, like we family, right? I can talk. I think the state, I mean, what these people had to deal with, how influential they became as regiments in the area that they fought, the bias that they faced in pay, the fact that the state waited until the last second to even, while every other place was creating regiments, to create one, the pushback that they got to create a regiment, the threats from Lincoln that if we capture you, you might not make it, and then what they faced in the field, and then had to face when they came home. All of that in its totality, I think the state should be doing something to honor these people. To me, these are heroes. And so, I'm not as familiar with who put the monument together, but whomever was associated with I think that's an amazing thing that the city or whomever was in attention to do. Also, I know that, and I think it was a funny thing, I know there's only 1,000 names on it. And I know that 39 of those names are people from the 30. And we know that there were nearly 500 people in the 30. And we know that there was another 13, there were actually 1,300 in the 29. And so if we wanted to recognize all of them, and there's 700 more people that I would like to see somewhere, right? Somewhere. I'm working on that. My nonprofit is working on trying to figure that out. Next slide. We're working on a lot of things. That's something we've been working on. We're working on that individual that I started this with that was buried in the Cove Park and was enslaved all his life and sent to prison and tried was enslaved. We're working with a developer in Middletown to place plaques and murals on a property that's being redeveloped that sits right where he used to work for those 50 years. And so his likeness will be on this building when the development is complete, this enslaved man. His name is Prince Morgan. Next slide. We're also in that town of Middletown. We're working with the Public Works Department and we're changing the name of the street he walked up every day to get to this rope walk to work for free. And we're going to get that street to have an honorary name. We worked with the town to get the ordinance set up, and we've already got that working. As soon as that's done, we're going to be the first request of name change, and we've got officials there that are working with us. So sometime next year, y'all hopefully will hear about that change. Next slide. We're also working in Waterbury to get better acknowledgement of a man by the name of Fortune, who died in 1798, and then his bones were used for the next 200 years. For medical science, 30 of those years he hung in a museum in Waterbury. And in 2015, he was finally buried. And so we're working on, we got a big project there, the Rise Up group, which is murals across Connecticut. We got the mayor's office involved. We got the state historic preservation office involved. And we've got multiple committees working now to get the location right. The location we want to do this in, and an artist rendering that we want to use. We're raising money for that. It's a $25,000 effort. My organization is applying $10,000. The Alex Toussaint Do Better Foundation is applying another $5,000. So we got 15. We're fundraising the other 10 to get that mural. Last but not least, if you want to contribute to that, or if you have ideas of other big places that we can start working to do the same thing. For me, I like to find these stories, find these people, and then inject these people into the communities they lived, worked, or died. Like, change names of buildings, change names of streets, create murals, like inject them into those communities. So if you have ideas, I'd love to hear that as well. And if you want to see the work that we're doing, you can go to alexbrienne.org to hear more about that. And with that, question? And no worries if there aren't any questions.
Everyone.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing all this with us. I was wondering, what's your research process like? I can imagine how you work at that.
Yeah, I had a lot of help. The stuff relative to my own family, I got to give credit to my sister. She was the first genealogist she had. She did a lot of really smart things. Like in the late 80s, early 90s, she was like taking video of people that we took for granted were going to die, right? We weren't thinking about it. And so she had a lot of information from just interviewing people in the 80s and 90s. And so a lot of that portion of the research of my family, I just didn't have to do as hard work because I had someone who did it for me. As it relates to the 29 and the enslaved people that I researched, yeah, it's a lot of time, a lot of energy. I travel a lot of places. I'm in DC sometimes. Sometimes I'm at the winery. Once I found documentation with regards to a person I was researching, and I had to travel to a museum in Massachusetts, and it was about an individual who was in Connecticut. I don't even know why the documents were over there. But it's resource sites like worldcat.org, indexing sites that kind of direct me to places, and then if I can get to the information online, I do. If I can't, I'm traveling. Yes.
Hi, my name is Bob Harris, and I'm a member of the Buffalo Soldier Motorcycle Club. I'm also the historian of my chapter here in Connecticut. But one thing I'd like to add to, if I may,
Absolutely.
to the conversation, during the Richmond campaign, the 29th to 30th, there was also another black or colored outfit, the 4th Infantry Colored Division.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a battle just outside of Richmond at a place called, I believe it was Schaefer's Farm. Okay?
Yep.
During that battle, I think, trying to get my figures right, there might have been either 14 or 15 African Americans that was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor at that battle.
Yes.
They were also commanded by a general by the name of Benjamin Butler. Butler commissioned a medal for them because they were so valiant, so brave in fighting.
Yeah.
And some of the brothers, not only were they awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, they also received the Butler Medal.
That's awesome. I knew about the medals. I didn't know for what battle that occurred. So that's really helpful. I appreciate that. And I knew, the 29 was added as a regiment, as a part of Butler's Army in Petersburg, Richmond campaign. You remind me of something, though. There's a Civil War museum just outside of Petersburg. And I don't remember the name of the museum. But what I do recall is at that museum, it's around the battlefield. And it has some Civil War era buildings there that you can tour. And you can choose who you want to give your tour. And the person you choose can be one of a select list of Civil War enactors, right? People who were dressed as an actual soldier. And one of the individuals you can choose is Alexander Newton. And so now I want to go down there and then tour and ask them for Alexander Newton. Because I know he lived in New Haven. And by the way, after that parade in Hartford, he said that then I took a train back home to New Haven. So he lived here. But anyways, thank you for that information. That's awesome. Yes.
I guess I'm going to stand. Yeah.
on behalf of my family, we really do appreciate you coming and sharing this information. We've been researching our family for the past maybe 12, 13 years, and we are direct descendants of Caesar and Lois Peters, who were enslaved in Hebron, Connecticut, and all of these people are his children,
Okay.
who served. And so we are interested in doing more. We're putting together our own foundation, and we're going to be sharing just like you. So we need to talk to you.
I would love to help.
Why we can do the wheel? You've already done it, my brother. Can we do it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. You know, as I told you when I first came in, I tend to tell these stories. I'm passionate about these stories, right? But the audience doesn't tend to be of color, so it's really meaningful to me with the families. There's an interest there in our history, and you want to hear about it, and you want to work towards, honoring these people in a way a little better than
That's
today. So, yeah, thank you for that. Awesome. If no other questions, well, I appreciate it if you have one. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
a quick one. So there's nobody else that's related to the Sealy family, right? Of the descendants that are here? Sealy? There's nobody else from that family, right? Charles Sealy, he was from Barnstead, Connecticut. None of them. So that would be his grandfather, fifth grade. And they actually went on, and this is a fun fact I want to add, because this really goes to just to acknowledge who those men were and how impactful they were.
Right.
So his family went on to intermarry with the Quandt family from the DMV area, DC, that whole triangle. And that family has more 5-star generals to serve in the United States Army at one time than any colored, black, white family, anybody in history.
All right.
So Charles Sealy's family went on to have more 5-star generals to serve at one time than any family in the history of the country.
That's amazing. That's awesome. What's interesting about Charles Sealy is similar to Isaac Hill. Isaac Hill was approaching 40. He was in his upper 30s
Yeah.
when he enlisted. Because these men were like, they had a passion to fix something. It was broader than just patriotism. Right? They were fighting for, like they said, for everyone to look like them. So you had men just, I'm a fighter. We got to fix this. And so, Isaac Hill joins, and he's at the upper end of this range of people that can enlist. And Charles Sealy, if I remember, was the same.
Yep, and his son, and another fun fact, in my family, one of my great uncles was actually his maid.
Oh, okay. So, I take my hat off to these men.
Very substantial.
They're at an older age in the range, and they're like, you know what, that's all right. That they have been given the appropriate credence at veterans, as they should. I know there were organizations like the Grand Army, the Republican, they had members, and I know there were some African Americans in those memberships. But I don't think they were given the appropriate reverence. So that's what I'm trying to do. But yes. I didn't mention it before we spoke, but now I forgot it. So that's okay. I appreciate all the questions. I appreciate all the comments. I appreciate you guys coming out and listening to talk about a topic like this. I appreciate you all as members or descendants of these men. Oh, that's what I was going to tell you. Some of these pictures, like the picture of Isaac J. Hill, the picture I got of Alexander Newton, and this picture, which I couldn't do as much of the 29th. I enhanced. I use my own tools to enhance these pictures. I use some AI tools to try to give us a better kind of feel, because I wanted to make sure as we looked at these pictures and as we looked at the individuals, they were real people. I didn't want some grainy picture with lines through it that you couldn't really identify faces. Like I wanted you to be able to feel them as real. And so the earlier pictures of Isaac J. Hill and of Alexander Newton, they're much more, the actual pictures in their books are much more grainy. It's much harder to see the detail. And so I worked with those things and used some tools to get those places. The 29th photo I couldn't do as much with because it's such further out. So the AI tools I was using couldn't do as much, but that was my intent, so that it was personal. Like you could look at it. So that's just an FYI. Awesome. Thank you all.